Hello and welcome to The Rural Well. I'm Bridget and Loren is here with me, and we are thrilled to have you joining us as well. And today we want to talk about an author, and it's a subject that so many of us are thinking of these days. Brian Reisinger is going to join us to talk about Land Rich, Cash Poor. I read the book. It's worth your time as well. So we'll get into all of that. And whether you're listening to us while you're shoveling snow, perfecting that favorite pie crust, or maybe you're rounding up eggs like gold pieces, we're glad you're here. We created this podcast with the well-being of rural areas like yours in mind for this episode. We know the ag industry has its challenges, and we're right alongside you. We really cannot wait to connect and inspire one generation to the other. So we'll get started. Loren, what are we going to talk about today?
You know what? I'm super excited. And I really like the quip there that you mentioned eggs, because if for those of you who are paying attention, we just had this little bit of a demonstration regarding size of eggs. And you know, it even goes part and parcel with what we're chatting today, because Brian, you talk about, you know, being the land rich, cash poor idea and all that encompasses. I often, even yesterday, I had somebody come buy eggs, and I said, I was just doing some case noting. He said, for the egg business. And I said, oh, no, no, I'm a social worker. And, you know, I listed off all the things that my husband and I do. And he said, I thought you guys were just farmers. And I was like, no, I mean, yeah, we are farmers, and it's an incredible opportunity. But the reality is farming is very demanding, and over 60% of us work off farm. And with it comes generations of value and generations of identity. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from Brian today and getting into his story, because it really encapsulates the ideas of what, you know, agriculture and being a farm family encompasses, and some of the complexities of relationships and the complexity simply of doing our best to honor our craft and raise animals and produce grains and oil seeds and things like that. So without further ado, I want to welcome Brian to the podcast.
Hey, good to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
So Brian, as I read through your book, to be perfectly honest, I found that there were two themes that went with it. One was the relationship of family as they work through generations farming, but also the highs and lows of having that farm and keeping that farm. So the physical versus the emotional. What was the first step in building this? Did you want to tell the story of the farm itself or the farm family themselves?
That's such a good question. I've never been asked it. And it started with the family. And the reason I say that is, you know, people ask kind of where'd the book come from. And I always say that I carried it around from the beginning, because I worked with my dad from the time I could walk, like anybody who grew up on a farm. And I remember, you know, people driving in and saying the farm was, you know, this farm had gone under, that farm had sold. You know, I've talked about that, but I've never been asked, did I start with the farm or the family? And for the reason that I just said, it started with the family, because I grew up knowing that our way of life was disappearing, and that made every single story I heard special in a kind of odd way. I say odd because many of the stories are beautiful. Many of the stories are hard. But there was a deeper appreciation for the beauty and a more meaningful reason to recognize the pain, because it was disappearing, because it is getting harder for farm families to make it each year, each decade, each generation. And so, you know, I'd heard the stories of a great uncle that I had who'd been crippled as a little boy in the fields. And I heard the stories of my grandpa, the time he slipped off a corn crib, broke his back, and my dad stepped up as an 8-year-old boy. And I heard the stories of the farm crisis, how my parents got through that, and on and on. And every farm family has those stories. And I thought maybe something that might be, I don't know if it'd be unique or special, but something that could be notable about us is maybe we're willing to pick up our heads and tell the story out there, because most farm families are just getting the work done, and our family's still trying to do that. But I thought maybe this is a chance to pick our head up and try to tell the story too. And so it started with those family stories, and I wanted to do something with those. And as I pursued a career off the farm in journalism and then public policy, and as I came back around full circle, getting the chance to finally really write about rural issues in a meaningful way, I saw the chance to do that. And I knew it was by investigating what are the errors of history driving the disappearance and weaving that with my family's story. But it always began with that family story. And I'm so lucky that I had the chance to reconstruct all that, because what I wanted to do was tell a story about my roots and where I'm from. And it just so happened that our family, like so many of your listeners, are living something that is tied to so many huge forces in our economy and our society. So if it'd been a totally different economic picture, a totally different family story, I guess I'd have been talking about different issues. But our personal issues and the stories we lived happen to tie into what happened to American agriculture and agriculture all across the world, really.
When I think about all of this that was going on, the story of the family, especially, and as a dairy farmer's daughter myself, I realize what it was like during some of those time periods. My dad's gone, but your dad is still here. Do you feel that being able to talk to him now and learn more of his story has been healing for you? Because I've heard Loren talk about generational trauma. And I'm curious how those two things tie together with Brian's story of the family trying to keep the farm, and then Loren being able to define generational trauma for us and maybe what that looks like today. So the biggest question is, Brian, do you think your dad has had some healing through all of this?
I would say I think he has. And like any real healing, I wouldn't say that it came easy, and there were times in this project and also in our life where I would have told you I didn't think that we were experiencing healing. And I'm glad to say we've come out on the other end of it. And I guess I'll just say, for folks who haven't had a chance to see the book or hear our story, my dad, struggled with mental health like so many of our farmers have and do. And it got to the point where he did have some of those darkest of thoughts of, taking his own life. And even though it's something that's against his belief system and against every fiber of his being, it was something that he was feeling because, the mental health issues that people in farming communities face comes in many forms. But one of them is that moment that you sell the cows, right? And we're grateful that my dad's still farming. My sister's working to take over the farm, and we're now a diversified small family farm, but at the time we were a 50 cow dairy, and he sold the cows, and that's like a death in the family. And it goes back to a man's purpose, and what I learned talking to my dad, and I learned examples of this going back for every single generation that I wrote about. What I learned talking to my dad was how much untold pain I didn't know about. And the opening pages of the book are the perfect example of it, which is I'm standing on the porch of my cabin out back of the farmhouse where we both grew up. I've got this little cabin in the woods where we kind of escape the few moments that we aren't working when I'm out on the farm with him. And it was the day after we sold the cows, and he was in tears. This man who's strongest person I know was in tears. And I remember wondering, is he thinking about that? And, excuse me, I was thinking about it a lot because the Farmer Angel Network, another organization that does really important work on this stuff, started in my home county, because there was a farmer who'd taken his life, and it's a beautiful, wonderful organization that provides peer support. And in any case, I was thinking about it, wondering, boy, is he thinking about that? And I kind of pushed that feeling down because it was too much to even face the idea that maybe my dad was thinking about it. Now think about how much harder it was for him to face that he was thinking about it, let alone talking to anybody about it. So there's a couple layers right there in just that one instant, right? In interviewing him and dozens of other family members and people in our community for the book, I learned from him that he had been thinking in that literal moment. He had been thinking those thoughts. And so I discovered that through the book. And so right there, that was an example of real pain that we experienced talking to each other. And I had a lot of mornings. I write at 5 a.m. when only the farmers are awake. And I had a lot of mornings where I discovered tears somewhere in there as I was trying to tell a story, whether it was about that thing with my dad or something with my grandpa or something I learned about the prior generation even before that. And I'm happy to say that after talking about the things we've talked about and telling our story, I think we have found some healing. Peace is a big word. I don't know, I think you have it at times, and it comes and goes like anything else. But I think we got, as close to peace as I might see us get to by at least talking about those things.
I hope it's okay to jump in here because what you talk about there, Brian, is like a nugget of gold. It's it's actually more common than we realize that we do have as farmers some of those thoughts, especially when we go through a loss like selling the cows. That's a tremendous loss. But by simply starting to air it, by simply starting to say, hey, I have this emotion, it actually causes the brain to kind of settle down and go, oh, that's what it is. But when we leave it untouched, it just like kind of burrows and flourishes in darkness, so to speak, because we haven't had that conversation about it. You know, when we talk about generational trauma, I don't think a lot of us realize that generational trauma is actually carried down the DNA for 3 to 4 generations, 5 to 6. Some researchers would say 5 to 6. Now, that doesn't mean that, the past will definitely repeat itself kind of thing, or that we're all affected the same way. It changes what we call the epigenetics, meaning how it's expressed in us, which is influenced by a number of factors. But it certainly stands to reason why we are impacted by the stories of our forefathers, right? Of our grandfathers and what they faced in our, my grandfather fought in World War I. A couple of days ago, I was going through his letters back home and, just reading his stories of the number of miles he marched every day. And then I stopped to really think about that. I'm like, wow, like the impact of their experiences isn't actually lost on us. It is something that's embedded in us. And yet the power of those stories, when we share them, that's where the sense of understanding, where the growth comes from. You mentioned the word peace, and I agree with you. That's a big word. I don't know that we can find it in any particular circumstance, but in relationship and in a sense of joining together, there is a lot of power in that, in that opportunity. And so, again, thank you for writing your story. And for those of you, when we talk about generational trauma, post World War II, post World War I, with a lot of immigration that came, a lot of people were involved in agriculture. And when they came to the US, when they came to Canada, they were in what we would call survivor mode. And some of them are still in survival mode, or their generations from, and it impacts our ability to be authentic and to be transparent. And so that's why there's so much power in telling your family story, and so much power in us learning our story and telling our story, is because it encourages that vulnerability.
It's so amazing to hear you talk about that, because, I'm not a clinician or anybody who knows about these things on that deep of a level, but everything you're saying, I see resonating through our generations. I think about my great grandpa, and we talk about this some, we tell his story, but, he escaped pre-World War I Europe. He'd been in the German military. He grew up in Bavaria, which was a place that had resisted German unification. And so when Germany was gearing up for World War I, there were a lot of reasons that someone like him wanted to be independent of that and come to America instead. But he'd served in the German military. So he came over here and he, had been in the military. He had traveled over the seas. He came here. He was trying to survive. He had a young son who was crippled in the fields. I mean, this was a man, you want to talk about survival mode. I don't even know him. And I get emotional just thinking about what it must have been like, because he died about 2 decades before I was born. And then, my grandpa, grew up with that. And I guess, from what you're saying, and I see it as you talk about it, hey, had that imprint on him, my great grandpa was a hard man, and my grandpa grew up in that environment. And on top of it, grew up in the Depression. And he only knew poverty until he was a man old enough to climb in the middle class. And then I talked about my dad, at the age of 8, stepping up on the farm because my grandpa slipped off a corn crib, broke his back. Well, he got back up on his feet, but my dad never really stopped doing the hard work of a man after he started at age 8. And I know a lot of farm families live that. And then I grew up I was born during the farm crisis, and I grew up in the 80s and 90s. And, I had a good life. We had a middle class living. It was one that was slipping away. It was getting harder for farms our size to provide it, but I had a good life. But I think about my dad and the way he would look at me when we were in the farmyard and he wanted me to do something. And I can almost feel all that weight of those generations through that. My dad was a good, kind man. I was lucky. I didn't have, so many of the kinds of situations, that families can have when there's abuse involved or other things. My dad was a good, loving, supportive man, but boy, that pressure that was there on that farmyard alongside that beauty every moment was just there. And when I didn't farm, I kind of faced the the feeling on my part that I was letting him down, even though he supported me doing everything that I did in my career. And, you know, even now I've come back around and I help on the business side, and like any farm kid on my quote unquote days off, they throw me in the tractor. But my role is to tell our story, and telling it and being able to honor him and all of them gives me, like I say, maybe a little bit of peace, but it's still a fleeting word because, you know, all that is hard fought to get there. And, in some ways I don't think I'll ever quite feel like I've done what I ought to have done unless I get a magic wand and go back and can take the burden off his shoulders, you know?
I don't know if I could take any more notes with everything that's going on here, because I'm working diligently in a couple of places to do it. But I have a question that I want the perspective from both of you. And that is, when it comes to talking to our parents, to our grandparents, and asking about those emotions, when were those dark times? Are they now? And how can we help them? I think it's different talking to a parent than it would be talking to a peer. So I want to ask Loren, as a professional, how do we approach that? Because knowing what I know now, when my dad sold his cows, he was depressed. And I would then want to ask Brian, how did you ask your dad? Because some of those who are listening may want to be able to have that conversation with their parents.
Yeah, you know, we know that our parents and our grandparents, you know, that generation, we didn't leave a lot of room for how are you feeling about things. And that really is based in that survival mechanism. Like, we need to work, we need to pay off this farm because we never want to experience the depression. In fact, it's so interesting to me because my neighbor up the road, who would be about, I think probably 70, pretty sure he's 70. He says to me one day, he says, Loren, if you ever need butter, I've got lots. And I'm like, what? You know? And he says, it must be my grandparents' influence over me from the depression. But when butter's on stale, I stockpile it, and I have probably 50 pounds in my freezer. And I was like, I honestly was like, well, thanks. Like, that's great because I live out in the boonies, you know, but, you know, we that generation didn't talk about what it was like. They thought that they were being resilient because they kept going. And there's a misconception about what resilience is in the farming community. And if you look at some of the ads online for farmers, you know, it's you put your boots back on and you get tough and you dig deep and you just keep doing it because it's what you're made to do. That is not resilience. Resilience means, wow, this is tough. I'm going to build a support network. I'm going to pivot. I'm going to care for myself so I can continue on doing this thing that I love. So your question is kind of, how do we ask that question? We get curious. And sometimes we have to leave it with people. We have to say something like, hey, you know, Mom, I wonder what that was really like for you during the farm crisis when you nearly lost the family farm, or when you did lose the family farm. And you leave it with them and allow them to open that door as safely as they feel they can.
So, yeah. Brian, what about your perspective, how you began that conversation with your dad?
Well, we, as we were going through that, we were very lucky that we had people around us who have some of the mindset that you guys do. Local farm family that had also sold their cows years ago and had worried about their husband, in part because of the same stories that we had grown up knowing, about the farmer who'd taken his life. And so they were stopping by and visiting. And they were just, and you know, it's so funny because as I think back on it, it really resembles what you're talking about, Loren, in the sense that they were just stopping by. They didn't say, we're going to come down and have a mental health chat with Jim, because my dad, you know, he'd had something to do on the back 40 that day, you know what I mean? And they just came by to visit. And for us, in terms of the conversations I had with my dad, you know, he's somebody who's stoic in the face of all weather, but then all of a sudden when he is emotional, you feel the weight of that emotion. And so the day after he sold the cows, he was having that emotion. I mean, he was, you know, that's maybe a day that I would like to think more farmers are willing to shed a tear, you know, and so he did. And so the door was a little bit open there, and I kind of just stepped through it from the standpoint, we just talked about his feelings. And I'll be honest, I didn't ask him kind of the question or get down into exactly what I feared he was facing, partially because I was afraid, but also because he was sharing and because we just wanted to understand each other. And we did a lot of that talking about how is it for you? How was it? So we worked through a lot of that emotion of that. I will say that it wasn't until later when I was working on the book that I outright asked him. And so, I know that by the time I'd asked him, he had talked with me and my mom and sister and the friends who'd come by to visit enough that he'd processed enough of those emotions that he'd begun to think about the future and his grandkids and really think about the next generation is what brought him out of it. So I would say that we had that conversation about how he was feeling, what he was going through, maybe without knowing the impact that it was having, And when I finally did outright ask him, it was because of the book, and we were kind of standing up against it. And maybe I felt a little safer asking him in a weird way because I was writing a book about it, like I have license to do this. And I don't think, we can't wait for, write a book about everybody you need to talk to. Feelings. So.
That's a good point. Can't wait for everybody till we can get the book done.
There's a lot more people to talk to than there are books we can get published, so.
Right.
I wonder too, if sometimes it made the topic a little bit more comfortable for you because it's like you're almost an outsider witness. Yeah. An outsider witness is kind of like where you look for that theme in somebody's conversation. And so often when we're in such close relationship with people, we're afraid to look for that theme. And so when you take kind of the outsider perspective from a more research perspective. But I think we can do that more often with our family because we are so ingrained in our culture of agriculture that if we take that step back and we kind of look at it from more of an outsider witness, I wonder if it won't help us investigate our own experience as well. And I think, Brian, you can probably speak to that even within this experience. How did writing this book, I'm sorry, Bridget, I'm so totally,
Okay.
But like, how did this role as author shape you from that perspective to look at your family situation from an outsider witness perspective?
Well, before I wrote the book, if you had me on sodium pentothal and got me talking about, on truth serum about my experience with my dad, I would have told you, oh, I failed my dad and, I got this other career I'm working on. But that's what I would have said, and most days you try not to think about yourself that way and say those things. That's jury, But after the book, I think I would say that what I realized, and I'd like to think I would say this if you put me on truth serum, whether I was feeling good or not, which is I realized that my role was as translator, because I grew up in this and I grew up loving my roots and I've come back around full circle to it, but I had to go have a journey off the farm to figure out what I was going to do with my life. And so I walked a little bit of that rural urban line, and I walked that line of being part of the agricultural community, growing up in farming, but also having gone out and explored the economic system that's left all of our family farms behind. And so there's a little bit of that tension there for me of walking that line between those worlds, but I'm grateful for it because it's helped me learn my role in this, which is talking to people like my dad, talking to people like my grandma. One of those people who you meet her and she grew up in the Depression, you know what I mean? And she's gone now, and it feels like a door was closed on a time of history for me, but I'm grateful I talked to her before she passed. But talking to those people and learning to tell those stories, I guess I figured out what's my part in all this is maybe just trying to help do it a little bit of translating,
Speaking of translating, oftentimes we take a quote and we break it down and we translate it into what works so well for us today. And Loren has one that I'm looking forward to listening to and giving our opinions on as we translate it for others.
Okay, thanks, Bridget. Yeah, Brian, I hope you can weigh in on this. Shifting gears is when we bring a quote in and just ask for perspective. And it's often interesting because sometimes we have some pretty different perspectives, either between Bridget and I or sometimes our guests. So I'm curious about this one. Agriculture is our wisest pursuit because it will, in the end, contribute most to real wealth, good morals, and happiness. So maybe we'll start. Brian, are you okay to start us off with that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. That quote hits me on such a number of levels. I guess maybe the quickest way I can relate it is to say, this is why we see farmers in Super Bowl commercials every year. This is why, this is why farming permeates our culture, because you got, from the very beginning of our country, we're talking about something. Look, they talk about like a country that makes things or doesn't make things. It's also true a country that grows things. If you don't grow your own food, if you don't use your land to sustain your country and your people, what do you have even on an economic level? That's a whole conversation you can have. But then it goes deeper, and it's about the virtue of it, and it's about who we are. And that's one thing that I discovered as I was working to tell our story and tie that to the bigger issues affecting our farms, which is we're not just losing the farms that feed us, we're losing a part of ourselves, as a people. And I think so. Anyway, it manifests itself in all kinds of ways, some meaningful and deep, and some kind of funny. If the Super Bowl commercial of that particular year kind of tickled you, but that's why, because we're always looking in a mirror, thinking about ourselves as a people who have lived close to the land, even if you didn't grow up anywhere close to a barn, in my opinion.
When it talks about the wealth, we could make fun of the fact that currently, if you have beef cows or eggs, you have nothing but wealth, right? Because everybody's scrambling to pay for those things. But the reality is, I think that popular culture emulates farmers as wealthy because of the richness of their lives. They get to live where they want to live, do what they want to do. Yes, it's a lot of hard work, but it is a noble cause. And if you listened to those who are politicians, celebrity, et cetera, they also will often say, but I refer back to, I got to go to grandma and grandpa's farm, or I had some sort of an agrarian root. And so we have made this a very positive in our lives, and more people want to touch it in some way, shape, or form. Maybe it's just even having their own backyard chickens or their flock of sheep, for whatever they so choose to do. So I think we still find it incredibly positive around us.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you both said. So I love this. We're unanimously endorsing the quote. By the way, it was written by Thomas Jefferson. So a wise fella, right?
And a farmer.
And a farmer. And I think about that word, wisest pursuit. When we look at our world, there's a lot of things we're pursuing. Generally, we live in a culture where we pursue wealth. And yet he's saying real wealth. And I love that you touched on that, because it's deeper than a capitalist community, although I get capitalism, and I'm not saying there's anything distinctly wrong with capitalism, but the wisest pursuit is real wealth, which has more to do with the investment in one another. One of the papers that I just wrote was on social capital. And social capital is really how we invest in one another as a way of becoming more resilient as an entire community. So it's an entire system, our rural system, as it becomes, able to withstand difficulty. And that's what this is talking about. It's that investment in one another that produces, real genuine. And it takes me back to watching Little House on the Prairie. And I think it's the second episode. It's called A Harvest of Friends. And it tells the story of Charles Ingalls was wounded. I forget I think he fell out of a tree with a kite, if I remember correctly. And sure enough, it was a new group of friends. They were new in the community, and they came alongside. And that, I think, is really the crux of what this quote talks about. Our investment in our community, in one another. And that's where that true wealth is found. So I love this. I think I might put it on my wall.
Brian just doesn't know that Loren and I secretly believe we are both Laura Ingalls Wilder in some way, shape, or form. And so that Little House on the Prairie comes up a lot for us.
No, sorry. It's so funny because I remember sitting on my grandpa's work shoes. He'd be drinking PBR, and we'd be watching Little House on the Prairie during the afternoons when he was watching me. And I didn't realize until I got exposed to more types of shows and because I was like 4 or 5, how much of that show really expressed how much of what our life was like, not because we're churning butter, but because that show really did talk about, the part of our country and of our people who came up living close to land and what all those things mean. And there's so much of culture that doesn't reflect that anymore, but you still see it in glimmers, but nobody reflects it quite like Little House on the Prairie.
Exactly. So we're going to have a whole offline discussion about what Michael Landon was up to. Nonetheless, that's very different. So whole offline discussion. Okay. I always love to end our day with something that puts a smile on our face and also allows those listening to be able to answer back something or say
comments.
podcast.
Comments.
Yep. So
we
make
got some
those.
really good ones on our last podcast. Did you notice those? They're so fun.
I love them.
Yeah, I love it. So folks, if you're listening, make sure you comment and keep the conversation going.
So here you go. For those of us who harken back to the days of remembering what it's like to get a newspaper or a milkman delivery at your house. Okay. If you could have something of your choice delivered to your doorstep every morning, what would it be?
Should I go first? Am I on the hot seat?
Go ahead, Brian.
This would kill me, but it'd be being from Wisconsin. It'd be a Friday fish fry every morning. I mean, I wouldn't last very long, but that's what I would take if I could.
That's so cool. Wow. Something ended up on my doorstep I don't know. I think it would be probably a cleaning lady, to be honest. Actually, I have a night angel every now and again. She comes to stay overnight to help Chris, and she is incredible. I won't say her name because she'd be too embarrassed, but she often will like tidy my kitchen or stuff. And so if she's on my doorstep in the morning, I'm like, oh, thank you. I'm so glad you're here. But if it was a food, honestly, we did still get our milk delivered when we lived. So in 1997, we lived in Prince Edward Island. We still got our milk delivered in a glass bottle on the doorstep. And that is simply nostalgic for me, because this past weekend I went to the farmer's market, glass bottled milk, and I just bought a couple of those up, and we're already out of it because it's like authentic, tastes delicious. I'm going back on Wednesday.
I would take the milkman again. Actually, up until 3 years ago, I had milk delivery service at my house. Showed up every Tuesday, put milk, butter, eggs, all the things in my refrigerator in the mudroom. Because in our lives today, how often do you open the fridge and go, so we're out of milk? Yeah, I would take a milkman back in a heartbeat. That would be awesome.
I don't know, the fish fry. But I hear you with the fish fry too. I mean, both they're competing for sure.
If people were still getting milk delivered to the doorstep, there'd be a lot of things about our country and agriculture that maybe wouldn't have slipped away from us. So, it might be a good sign if we were getting milk delivered to our doorstep again.
For sure. Very cool. Well, folks, that brings us to the end. On behalf of Bridget and I, we want to say a tremendous thank you to Brian. And we have had this little side conversation where we're going to invite Brian back because there were so many nuggets of wisdom in the conversation that we would really love to learn more. And we also want to drive you to your local bookstore or wherever you can find it. Maybe, Brian, you can share where you can find your book, Land Rich, Cash Poor. We really appreciate you being here today, Brian.
Absolutely. You can find Land Rich, Cash Poor in bookstores all over. They'll have it or they can order it for you. It's also available online, Amazon, anywhere else you buy your books. And I just appreciate anybody who picks it up, but really keeps the conversation going to shed light on these issues. So.
Yeah, I agree. And I agree with you and with Bridget that the trajectory is changing, and we are seeing more people willing to kind of take a deep breath and look at some of the hard stuff from the past and kind of where we're at now. And folks, if that's you, we encourage you to reach out. Don't forget, you can contact a therapist who's agriculture informed through the National Farmers Mental Health Alliance. And don't forget to leave a comment about if you could have something delivered to your door, what would it be? Thanks so much, folks.